She was a piece of evolution unto herself.
She was a teacher, scholar, activist. And I'm like, for myself, that's what I want to be.
We as a program wouldn't be here without the work and focus of our academic mothers before us. And we have giants in the field.
She would say, if you think, then what are you going to do? So it was always connected to action for the good, for the common good. And I've tried to live up to that.
She was a live wire, a spark plug, and someone who was very much engaged in women's issues as well as in socioeconomic issues.
Going where angels would fear to tread, she treaded. If it was for a matter of peace, justice, equality, to break through barriers, to cross boundaries, she was there. No question about it.
The more I know about her, the more I am just enamored of who she was, because she took chances and she took risks.
She had a network of people on the local, on the national, international, and she really knew how to work with people, gather them.
Pat traveled. She went to South and Central America and Africa and just wanted to connect with all the diversity of the world. And she took her spirit wherever she went. Wherever she saw a need, she wanted to have somebody addressing that need. And if she could get in there and help, she would.
She never neglected the prophetic role. She was really comfortable in confronting and in speaking truth to power. She was fearless. And at the same time, she was always ready to listen, and she was always ready to pursue the argument. So there was this very strong intellectual dimension as well.
Pat participated in many interfaith groups in prayer and activism, and had no fear of being arrested at a demonstration, standing for what she believed.
Pat must have had a phenomenal journey, because she was Sister Richard, and she was an academic. And then she taught, and then she came to Los Angeles, and she got involved in all these social justice causes. And you could just, as she told the story, you could just kind of see her evolve into an entirely different person, from being the teacher and the academic into being, this feminist who was willing to have herself arrested or to protest or to start this phenomenal program for women of faith who wanted to experience kind of the same thing.
Pat's life was a wonderful life. When I think back on the whole thing, her being a nun, her getting her education, her being a really excellent teacher and a real academic, and then her conversion experience when she heard a lecture at Claremont that suddenly shined the light for her on the need for action for social justice. She knew she had all this knowledge. And all of a sudden, it's like, now she knows what to do with the knowledge.
She carried the capacity to really link her incredible mind with her amazing heart. And the two stayed connected, just connected through her life.
She was a nun, a sister in the Immaculate Heart community, and in that role, she was a teacher of philosophy. What makes this story so dramatic is the time in which this took place, because we were involved in the movement of the 60s and early 70s, so that was a political and a social movement in our country. Vatican II had taken place, and so what was happening in the religious community, and Pat was a leader in this, that her religious community was rethinking everything about what it means to be in the church, what it means to have a community, what it means to do service, what it means to have liturgical times of coming together. Pat was a key player and a leader in the transition of the Immaculate Heart Sisters to become an independent lay community and take the courageous step of cutting off the support and the authority that came from their papal vocation. What has come from that is a very successful and long-living, ongoing religious community.
Moving from a canonically recognized community to an ecumenical community is the story of hundreds of women who took control to define their own religious life. And the architects of that movement, when the Immaculate Heart, the congregation of the Immaculate Heart community, rewrote their rule, there were several brilliant women in the Immaculate Heart community who wrote their new religious rule. And Pat Reif was highly significant in writing that. And she would be one of the first people to say that it was the community and working groups and task force and reflecting on their lived reality that made them follow the directive of Vatican II.
Probably the largest exodus of priests and nuns was after the signing of the Vatican II documents that came out in 1965. And during that time, there was debate as to whether to have married priests or women priests. There was a huge debate going on during the enclaves that they were having about the Vatican II documents to sort of modernize the church and bring it up to date. Unfortunately, none of those got passed. So at that point, there were quite a few priests and nuns who had no longer wanted to be associated with the church because of those reasons. And so there was a mass exodus in 1965, which I think even began to set the stage for the IHMs leaving when they did.
The night before Easter in 1970, it was a frightening time. The community had decided, with the Mother General and then first president of the new Immaculate Heart community, that the work they had done had so many implications for how they would dress, pray, work in the world, follow their gifts and talents beyond teaching and nursing, worthy, wonderful vocations, but they had even more. To wear the clothes of, like this, the people of the world, that there was no turning back. Hundreds of sisters signed those papers and said, I surrender the vows made to the Roman Catholic Church. Didn't deny them, but suspended them. So that there were 600 sisters at the peak of the order, no longer connected as a canonical institute to Rome. And Pat was one of the encouraging voices for the timid, the frightened, the wondering. She sat with many people in her community, just talking it through, showing the logic, helping them to see where she was. And as Anita Caspary said, I choose to go and hope you will be with me. So that night, several hundred women made their commitment now, not as Roman Catholic sisters, but as members of a new Christian ecumenical lay community. They didn't know what was ahead. And the picture of Pat that night with a candle in front of her stays with me. She was at peace.
She was the prophet. They've talked about her that way, and the inspirer and the one who held them to the new ideals that were articulated by Vatican II. This was an internal reform of the church, and she was a leader within her order and among her sisters of a response to that. And it was a 3-year process. And at the other end of it, she had gained a great deal of insight in what it could mean to create a new kind of an institution, a new kind of church, a new kind of theological training, and above all, a new kind of space for women.
And so they left and started their own community, and then they did whatever they needed to do in order to form this new community, which has been going on now for the last 40 years. And it's a community that is inclusive, not just strictly women, but includes men, children, families, anyone who feels that they want to follow what the IHM stand for.
this was the only community that collectively left the authority of the Pope and took their vocation then as a lay vocation and created a new structure. I mean, that's what Pat's background was that was the crucible in which she was forged that then created a vision for her. She drew on that when she created the Immaculate Heart program in feminist spirituality. Pat's new vision involved a new vision for religious community. They became a lay community with different authority structures. Her vision included a new vision for what it meant to be a scholar, an academic. And so in each of these places, I just found myself fascinated and resonating with her understandings. And she had a new vision of what it meant to have women's community, what it meant for women to have a special space of their own and to do their own leading and their own teaching and to practice power with rather than power over or power under.
In order to stay nuns, we had to go against what we thought was right for our own future. And so we chose, not all of us, but the majority chose not to stay nuns. And that seems like a really feminist thing to do. We weren't bowing to male hierarchical dominance. We were standing up against it. But we weren't feminists, in my humble opinion. We weren't feminists through and through because this was kind of a new thing. And feminism was a new word in our vocabulary. And we didn't even use it at that time. It wasn't until later we reflected on what we had done and realized that that was taking a feminist stance. Then what happened is, as Pat became more and more a feminist, she educated the community. And she did it by her example and her words. She would stand up at meetings, we'd be discussing something, and she would bring in the feminist viewpoint. And we'd go, oh. And she didn't always say, if you're a feminist, this is the way you believe. But she just spoke with such conviction. And sometimes people got tired of it, like, oh no, Pat stood up again and reminded us of something we maybe didn't want to hear. But she was relentless. And gradually it began to sink in, and it changed our attitudes toward life.
Religion was looked upon askance, and how could a feminist be religious, whether a Jewish feminist or a Catholic feminist, as if somehow Catholic feminists were in bed with the Pope? Well, fat chance. And Pat Reif and others, I think, proved that very explicitly and very helpfully early on.
She's devoted to women as the core of the marginalized people of the globe, whether individually, singly, in families, in communities. It's women who often bear the worst abuse and poverty as they struggle to help their children. We're seeing that today, aren't we? So all of that, social issues, church issues, the community of her sisters who are trying to reform and become contemporary witnesses in the world, she decided she was a feminist. She knows the day she became a feminist. She said she became a feminist on October 18th, 1975 at 2 p.m. She was reading out on the lawn that day, and she said to us, it suddenly all made sense to her. It all came together. The world had to be looked at with a feminist lens. And one time, one of the sisters who had been interviewing people in the community for oral history, I think Pat was such a force of nature. She could be a little intimidating, but she was the gentlest soul. And this one sister confessed to Pat, I really don't know what that means. What does it mean to be a feminist today? And how does it mean for us? Pat's voice lowered, pace slowed, the gentlest terms possible. She said, well, everything changes. Everything in your life changes when you see women as fully capable human beings with every capacity to love, to teach, to govern, to nurture, to think, to do everything in their nature, that a male hierarchy suppresses this and negates the talent, the goodness, the power that lies within every single woman, including you and me. So when you see us as empowered, strong people of spirit and love, everything changes.
In those days, she understood very well that feminist models were different than the kyriarchal or patriarchal models that her religious community was based on. So she insisted that the kind of decision-making and shared leadership and responsibility and maturity, assumption of the maturity of members, would be something that she and her sisters would experience.
She had no trouble at all critiquing the church as far as what it had done to oppress women. She understood it. She didn't like it, and she was unabashed in her critique.
She was going to live intentionally, and I think that's what feminism brings, is this intentional living that really makes us realize that other ways of being are just not holistic. And I think she realized that and embraced it. And also as a woman felt her own strength and her own power and agency.
In the mid-'80s, Pat Reif and others decided to set up what was the first program in feminist spirituality, degree granting or at least certificate granting program in feminist spirituality in the country and perhaps in the world.
In 1984, she founded the Immaculate Heart College Center program in feminist spirituality. And I thought, this woman is just incredible. She was so passionate about her topic and so clear and so organized. I just went back and looked at some of my notes, believe it or not, from 1988, and they were wonderful. I thought I could just reread my notes and relearn everything she taught.
She was able to staff the program with eminent scholars throughout those years. And there were students who were very faithful in completing the program and earning their master's degrees. But the success of the program was due to Pat's commitment to feminism and feminist spirituality.
The program at that time was highly unusual, and there was no other one offered in the United States. So we attracted a variety of people. She really created the curriculum: feminist spirituality, feminist ethics, feminist theology, feminist history. These were all required courses. And a practicum, and that's very important, that a woman would not be able to get her MA unless she did some kind of solidarity work with other women and their children and their families. That really expanded people's horizons.
She showed women studies people the importance of religion and spirituality as both an intellectual and cognitive issue as well as a practical issue about where many people get meaning and value.
So it didn't matter whether it was economics or immigration or mental illness or addictions or violence against women. She wasn't afraid of any of that stuff, and she was only too happy to bring in people who could speak to those issues.
She made her program, organize it around spirituality to get at that depth and that complexity of experience of religion that goes beyond dogma. And there was a vision for a new kind of ritual as a way of articulating a new experience of the divine, as a way of articulating a new understanding of God.
She was a pioneer in both classes and workshops and so forth on the arts in religion and the arts from a feminist perspective. So I think those are enormous contributions that have, and the proof of them is that those have become gold standard in the field now.
It was a very ecumenical program. Well, nobody was doing anything even close to this. Yeah. And she was very cutting edge. And I mean, there were Presbyterians, there were Methodists, there were Buddhists, certainly Catholic women involved in the program. I mean, that did not matter. It was, you could be a woman of faith, and you were welcomed with open arms into her studies. It was actually part of the fabric, part of the fiber of the program, and it was critical. I think she thought bringing all those divergent worldviews together was a critical part of what we were experiencing and learning.
She brought to LA over the course of the next 16 years all of the leading women scholars in all religious traditions. And she brought them to LA to teach a weekend seminar in MA in feminist spirituality. We got to meet each other in that process. And for the women who were in the program, it was the most incredible richness of an education that one could have gotten anywhere on these questions. And it fueled the movement. It kept the movement going forward. And so I think that the impact of what she has done is even stronger when one looks at her impact on the scholars who produced this new knowledge, feminist spirituality, and that she was the great salesperson. She got it distributed. She got it out there. She made a kind of space, otherwise who would know? So she created a whole new concept of learning and a whole new institution for learning.
She was always someone for whom the intellectual work was not all there was. It was intellectual work in the service of social justice and social change. And so it was no surprise that in the 80s, when she developed this program, that the focus of the feminist theology program as she directed it was not simply to look in a disinterested way or an objective way at feminist issues in religion, but in fact to see how they focused in terms of the work of social change.
What we did, studied, painted, was applied to the real world right away. We were in Los Angeles. There were riots, there were war protests, there were needy people in the inner city, and we were engaged in all of that.
Pat kept saying to me, okay, you have enough credits, we need to graduate you, and I'd say, okay. And then I'd take another year of classes. So it was only because there just wasn't anything else comparable to the program in feminist spirituality that she had. And so I just kept taking classes. And finally, probably about 10 years after I'd started taking classes, she came to me and said, okay, I cannot justify keeping you as a student. She said, you can come back and take any class you want to take, not a problem, but you need to graduate. So I graduated with 2 or 3 other women at the time.
One of Pat's leadership contributions was that she demanded, and I mean demanded, of her own community, that is those who had left the institutional church, left the canonical community, she demanded that they be coherent in their leadership style. Because the community they left was a top-down, where the mother superior or the president or whoever it might be was telling those underneath what to do. Or at least okaying the choices that they made. And I think Pat and her friends took very seriously their own responsibility as mature adults. And that has taken Catholic women religious some time to internalize and to operationalize. And I think that they were among the early people doing that. And she did not let that go. She didn't let that be how the community would do it. It also had to be how the center would work and how her own program would work. So she was coherent in all of those areas in terms of socializing and sharing resources and listening very carefully to people. And that's what I found unique about her from the very time I met her at 24 years old, that she cared what I thought as a young person. She took seriously my view of it. She didn't necessarily agree, and she certainly had her own wisdom, but she was very generous in listening and empowering women to do the work they felt necessary to do.
I would have said it'd take 100 years to get to where we are now. And so those early pioneers in the movement, and Pat Reif is a really significant one. They had a hard road. There was no receptivity for their vision. There was resistance, there was fear, there was hatred, there were politics. It was a huge struggle for that generation, and it took enormous courage.
Pat brought her mind, her trained mind, to bring systems analysis of what needed to be changed. And that was really important during those years. People weren't necessarily thinking about strategic action, especially in the faith community, and systemic change. And, you know, as I recall it, she was one of the early people bringing that to all these different coalition groups that she was involved with at that point.
So her thrust, her passion, her commitment in the 80s was anti-war, anti-nuclear proliferation, concern for the poor, for the hungry. Martin Luther King talked about poverty, racism, militarism, materialism, and Pat was very active with organizations that were promoting justice and promoting peace.
It's not simply out of a political necessity. It's a faith necessity. Her faith drove her to do this in response to her God.
Her early work on ending hunger, questions of housing, and other justice issues in Los Angeles dovetailed with her understanding of the importance of getting the U.S. out of El Salvador, the kind of Central American concerns that she had. And those all together dovetailed with her feminist understanding, which in some ways came later. When she named sexism as a sin, she was really looking in a consistent and coherent way at the whole agenda that we talk about in terms of theopolitics.
In addition to teaching, she was starting to get involved in some other issues, like the Interfaith Hunger Coalition, starting a way that good food could be brought into neighborhoods that didn't have access to good grocery stores. And later on, actually, she was quite instrumental in getting farmers markets to accept food stamps so that people who ate via food stamps could buy fresh things and that sort of thing. So there were these different aspects to her.
This was a time that the Pope had come for a visit to Los Angeles, and so there was a great deal of excitement around that. She had first requested a meeting with the Pope, and that wasn't actually granted. And she organized with others a demonstration to welcome the Pope when he came. And she was very media savvy. And so this was my first time to be in a demonstration and to begin to see how this kind of power worked. So what she organized was a demonstration that included women carrying a coffin that was draped in black, and many of the women were dressed in whiteface as a way of highlighting the drama. And the message was the death of a relationship with the women of the church. Well, we were a demonstration, there was lots else going on, but what she put together caught the eye of the news media, and we were on television in the news hour. So both her courage to organize it and the intelligence and insight that she used to create an event that the media would pay attention, and its successfulness was very exciting and very exciting to be a part of.
She invited me to be part of a civil disobedience action at the Rockwell headquarters in El Segundo. And it was to be a nonviolent vigil, but one in which we blocked the roadway for a while and sat in offices and in front of doorways. And I wasn't sure when I went if I would be willing to stay there when people were asked to move. but I came to feel a certainty that it was important not to get up and leave. And Pat was another person who did not move. And so I think there were 8 of us that time that were, arrested. And we wound up in a little jail holding cell, 1 bench, a very small space. And what it became pretty quickly, because a number of us were very new at doing this, Pat wound up doing a kind of, I would say, a mini seminar on peace and justice, the real role of law, the importance of speaking with our bodies as well as our voice. And I can still picture her leaning. We took turns sitting on the bench, sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall. And I picture Pat leaning against the wall, just ruminating about, the meaning of what we had done and the consequences potentially of that. And by the time we were leaving that cell, we were like a little sisterhood. They kept us handcuffed, but we found a way to kind of hold hands leaving. And, it was like, eventually went to trial. We were found guilty for the charges, I think, were trespassing, failure to disperse, and being a public nuisance, which kind of chuckled us because, yeah. Pat says, as we're walking outside after that little jury trial, she said, "So, how do you feel about being guilty?" And so people are saying, "Well, I don't feel guilty," and blah, blah, blah. And she engaged us in a little conversation about that. And she said, "Well, there's alternative language for that, don't you?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Some people would call it being faithful. I do." And I still get chills because I remember the truth of that.
We were part of the group called U.S. Out of El Salvador, and we did a resistance, civil disobedience downtown in front of the federal building. Yes, right here in Los Angeles. So there must have been about 60 or 70, maybe 80 of us. And when you go to jail like that, you're all put in the same room. And so you really get to know people, waiting to see what's going to happen.
There is a picture of her being arrested someplace. I remember that. But, back in the day, that was not something that people of faith, and particularly women, didn't do that. There's a story of someone, I don't know who arrested her, whether it was the sheriff or LAPD, but they had heard through their grapevine that she was very dangerous. And I just thought, yeah, well, she probably is. You need to remember that.
Another area where Pat was ahead of many of us was the issue of whether women could be ordained priests in the Roman Catholic tradition. Of course, they'd already been ministers and priests in many other denominations, actually bishops as well. Women had been bishops in the Methodist Church and more recently Episcopal Church and so forth. But Pat was, although her outlook and her friends were very interfaith, she was Roman Catholic. That's who she was. However, she was a Roman Catholic woman who I remember her saying, I think she may have even had a button once, or maybe it was a bumper sticker on her car or something, but it was, let me see if priests come in both sexes. It was like, why should this be a question?
The ordination of women issue was absolutely central for Pat. And it was absolutely central in the Women's Studies in Religion program at Claremont. I want to talk just briefly about Woman Church, which was a movement that Pat was deeply involved in. And we started a woman church connected with the Women's Studies in Religion program that ran for 10 years and participated in this. But what this space created was a kind of laboratory for women. What could church look like? What could it feel like if we drew on women's understandings, women's insights, and women's needs? And so in this women church context, new liturgies were created, rituals were experimented with, songs were written, litanies were composed. So all across the country in these alternative, let's call them house churches, new forms of worship were being created. This then became a laboratory for the women priest movement, because so much of that work had taken place in those women church contexts. And so the ordination of women is really one of the legacies of the kind of work that Pat was doing, and especially in the context of women church. So we have followed it very closely. I've been to several ordinations of women Catholic priests, and they have been called by Catholic congregations to be priests and enact this new way of being church.
I would imagine she's rejoicing every time another woman who feels that call is given the opportunity to serve the people of God in that way. At the same time, recognizing that the structural church, the hierarchical system, has not yet changed in some fundamental ways.
Women's Studies in Religion here at CGU is a really unique program. So if you look at North America, there are only 2 programs in Women's Studies in Religion. One is at Harvard Divinity School, and there's WSRP program there, Women's Studies in Religion program. The other one is here at CGU. And they're actually quite different programs. I like to think of them as sister programs in a way. But the Harvard Divinity School program focuses on bringing 5 faculty members, scholars, usually senior scholars, from across the globe together to work for 1 year, sharing a colloquium, teaching a graduate course at Harvard Divinity School, and then doing something. We don't do it that way here at CGU. Our program actually trains graduate students directly. So we don't bring in faculty. Instead, what we're doing is we're working to sort of develop, train, and prepare graduate students at the master's and the PhD level to go out and study more and teach more women's studies and gender studies now into academia globally.
In the creation of the Women's Studies in Religion program, Pat was always present for me in what her vision was, what she was trying to do. And so there were crucial elements in the way in which this program evolved that go back to Pat. Not only was her vision important, but Pat was a consummate politician. I mean, she really knew how to deal with administrations, and she was a really effective organizer. So on the politics and the practicalities of creating a program in a patriarchal environment, because of course at first there was a lot of resistance to the idea of starting a women's studies program. There were only men on the faculty, and so we were confronted with a situation similar to Pat's in a patriarchal church. And so one of the things that was crucial in our discussions was what you need is 2 things. You need an endowed chair, and you need a program. The endowed chair anchors the program, and the program multiplies the effect of a single chair in a discipline. So it's those kinds of political strategies where Pat was also very useful.
The Women's Studies in Religion program is special because of those last words at the end, right? The in religion. There are lots of women's studies programs across North America. You can find them all over the place. There are lots of gender studies programs. This one, again, is different and special because what we're doing is taking a particular set of lenses and applying it to religion. So, what's the connection then between women's studies and religion? How can we explore all these different aspects? Pat Reif gave us one particular way through the material, and that was her work in social justice and activism. But it was, again, coming from the perspective of an IHM, coming from the perspective of Catholic women's social justice. And that's fantastic, but she did not want it just to be about Catholicism or Catholic social justice. She wanted to make it much more broad than that. And just like we do here in Women's Studies and Religion, we're not looking specifically at the Christian tradition, right? We're looking at women's studies in all kinds of different religious traditions across time, whether it was a long time ago, this is very, very contemporary material, whether it's here in the United States, whether it's across the globe. So we're very broad in many ways in what it is that we're looking at and looking for. In other ways, we're really very specific, right? How can we find these moments that are meaningful to us, right, around issues, again, of women's spirituality and social justice?
While we were just beginning to create the program, we organized a conference on women and goddesses at Claremont. And so that was a very exciting venture, and we had all religious traditions represented and scholars on the various goddesses in those traditions and questions about how does a feminine divine impact women's status in society. And so Pat came to that, and she was part of that. And afterwards, when we were having a discussion, a public discussion with members about the conference, she stood up and raised the challenge and said, in this conference, there have been very few women of color. You need to be paying attention to diversity in all of its multitude of forms, not just gender. And that was a powerful critique, a really important one, and it was consciousness raising, and that became really a central commitment of the Claremont Women's Studies and Religion program, again, inspired by Pat Reeve.
We also have male students who are very interested in these issues and how they relate to their upbringing, to how they relate to the way that they understand the world, to use what they learn in women's studies and religion to help make them better men, better husbands, better fathers, better scholars, better teachers, right? And better citizens in our society. You need some sort of good analytical help, I think, to be able to rethink why things are the way they are, and the courage and ability and strength and wisdom to go and change some of the things that might be changed.
When she suddenly got ill, it went really fast. And so when she died, all of us had this powerful feeling that her presence needed to continue. She had given so much. She had been such a visionary. She had led us all and inspired us all in many different ways, that we were all trying to figure out how to create a legacy for Pat. We had a meeting, and from the very first meeting, we were on the same page. And so what Claremont had to offer was the institution and the context of the Women's Studies in Religion as a place to locate a lectureship in honor of Pat Reeve, and the community had the financial resources to fund it. And so we've had a very rich partnership ever since.
The Pat Reif lecture series is really important. It is our key lecture. It is the main event for a sort of capstone lecture that we have here in the WSR program at Claremont. So it's tremendously important. It's actually been going since 2002. And it's an opportunity for us every year to sit and to think really hard about who's out there that we would like to bring in to help us to think in a different way, to help inspire us, and to help us to take some action in this world.
So from 2002 until today, every year we invite a feminist theologian to come and speak to us on different issues, social justice, reproductive justice, domestic violence, women's ordination. We have women coming from Asia. We have had women come from Africa. So, we're a very ecclesial group that invites women, and we try to make sure that we get a broad reach of women.
I think it's important that at the forefront of a feminist agenda, that it's not just theoretical, but for women within our field, most of them are really involved or engaged in activist work with women. So that's something that's really important about the Pat Reif Lectureship series too, because it demonstrates how women are actually like living out their activism, their spirituality, and the theoretical perspectives. And then it invites us as well to be able to discern that for ourselves. Like, how does that look in my life? How does it look in the way that I understand my spirituality, the way that I do my activist work?
The question is for us, how do we honor Pat Reif's legacy? So the way for us to do that, again, is to think hard on what was important to her, to bring forward issues in social activism, social justice, to think about issues around women's spirituality, about sometimes resistance to women's movements, women's activism, women's spirituality even, and to see how these issues are still active and live right now in the world. So this is very much what we try to do in WSR as a program. And the lecture itself is a way to kind of to bring that moment into focus for an audience that's free, it's open to the public, bring everybody in from all kinds of places to listen to a speaker who honors this legacy of Pat Reif.
These are women that we're studying about in our texts. And I think it's really important that we know who our foremothers are. And with this lecture series, we've brought people on a global level. We wouldn't have access to these women unless we had the Pat Reif Lectureship series.
So we have a great legacy here. And the question is now, how do we continue? How do we continue to build on these strengths of our mothers?
Obviously, in the Women's Studies program, the women that are teaching or the professors that are teaching who know about the lecture series certainly invite their students to come, because it's a way of knowing sort of what their future might be in women's studies and feminist studies, and how they can carry on Pat's legacy in being leaders and having agency and speaking out about these different issues that are really, really difficult.
In terms of the work I'm doing now, I owe a lot to Pat Reif because of the groundbreaking work she did with the Immaculate Heart College and her bringing feminist scholars, validating women's voices in the academy. I feel as if I'm in debt to her for paving the path for me to be able to do what I do.
Pat had a very broad view. She was brilliant intellect, a dedicated feminist, which is not anti-male, but she did spot discrimination, dominance, patriarchy, and called them by their name.
The biggest issue is still white dominance, white privilege, white supremacy. I mean, come on, it is. We're the problem. And Pat recognized that. She understood it completely. And I think she would be thrilled today to see how women of color, women from developing countries, women from other places have engaged in feminist thought and brought their own experience to it, which is very different than me as a white woman.
She was such a regular soul, a real good scout, regular soul kind of person. And for all of her erudition in terms of being a philosopher and knowing a lot about religion, she was just a really down-to-earth, genuine person.
She liked to play tennis. She liked having a good time. She was an ordinary person. She didn't dress up. She didn't try to impress. She was just Pat.
She was a model for me in many ways. She was a mentor for the journey. She was a friend, most of all, a friend. I never took a class from her in the classroom, but I learned an incredible amount.
Many people didn't know that Pat had a debilitating illness. I knew about it probably the last 15 years of her life, but that did not deter her from acting on her vision, to promote justice and to promote the education of women. I just think that there's a real deep humility in a person who can keep that kind of pain and suffering to herself and maybe share with her close friends, but still keep moving and moving toward the direction of fullness of life, not just for herself, and not just having meaning in life, but actually knowing that the pursuit of justice and the pursuit of peace is an act of love.
In her retirement years, she moved into Claremont, Pilgrim Place, where it was no Catholic had been there before, but she lived and died with her Christian brothers and sisters. So to be around her and just say, well, look at her, she's just one single person, and she has no money. All true. She was magnetic, so people were drawn to her. She worked until she couldn't work anymore.
Pat had prepared her total funeral, and she wanted to share it with us. And when she started to share it with us, many people don't know this, but Pat had a beautiful voice, and we sang all the songs that would be at her funeral about a week or two before she died. I share that because it's rare where a person who, even toward the end of her life, when she accepted her illness, Pat faced that in peace, tranquility, and creativity. Here she's creating her own vigil. And of course I attended it, and it was just beautiful.
I was so grieved when she died because I thought she loved life so much and she had so much more to give. So I count her as a great blessing for myself, for the community, and for humanity.
I hold Pat in sacred memory very, very often after all these years.
She was just absolutely amazing.
She is one of many powerful women within the IHM community.
It's really important to remember women like Pat Reif and their courage and what they suffered and their strength and what they endured, because that was the cost of bringing about the change that we live through, and we could lose it.
Pat Reif is an old friend of mine. I knew her back when she was teaching at a college in the 1960s. So what is Pat Reif's legacy in women's studies? Pat Reif was particularly invested as she was the dean of that program in women's studies, Feminist Spirituality. That was a very important program. She headed that. I don't remember now how many years, but certainly for a number of years, and I used to teach there. So I would come out from, I guess, Chicago is where I was at that point. And I would give, let's say, a weekend intensive or something like that. I think it was a very important program because many, many people went through it. They were really shaped by that program for an ongoing career in issues about women and social justice. So I think of that program in feminist spirituality and all the people who went through it and who carried on that legacy in their own lives. I stayed with Pat a few times here when she moved into Pilgrim Place. I was teaching up in Berkeley when I heard she began to suffer from this illness, which, of course, really brought her life to an end all too swiftly. And at one point I called her up and we were talking on the phone, and she said, "I'm just not ready to leave this beautiful world." And so I just remembered her voice. I can almost hear it in my head, her voice saying, "Well, I'm just not ready to leave this beautiful world." That's something I think about when I think about Pat Reeve.